Uganda, a nation carved from the contours of colonial ambition and post-war geopolitics, entered the post-independence era in a state of profound vulnerability. Its boundaries, drawn with scant regard for the intricate mosaic of ethnicities, languages, and traditions, had produced a country that was diverse in its heritage but fragile in its unity. The legacies of British colonial rule were imprinted deeply on its political and social structures. Administration had been centralized under foreign oversight. Education opportunities were unevenly distributed, and access to economic resources had favored some communities over others, creating enduring disparities that would later fracture the sense of national cohesion. As independence approached in 1962, Uganda's population harbored hope and trepidation in equal measure. The promise of self-determination was intoxicating, yet the country's institutions remained nascent, inexperienced, and ill-prepared to manage the centrifugal forces that independence would release. The political landscape of Uganda at the time of independence was both dynamic and precarious. Multiple parties, often rooted in ethnic or regional identity rather than coherent ideological platforms, vied for power in a young parliamentary system that had little precedent in self-governance. The Democratic Party, with its base among Catholics and educated elites, and the Uganda People's Congress, largely representing northern and central constituencies, offered contrasting visions of Uganda's future. At the same time, the Kabaka Yeka, or king-only party, represented the interests of the Uganda Kingdom, whose monarch had negotiated a semi-autonomous arrangement within the newly independent state. These tensions were not merely political. They carried historical resonance, recalling centuries of localized governance disrupted by foreign conquest and colonial manipulation. Within this environment, political alliances were fragile, and the stakes of leadership were not abstract. They were intimately tied to the survival and prosperity of communities long marginalized or favored in unequal measure. Amid these structural complexities, the military occupied a unique position. It was both a legacy of colonial control and a potential arbiter of national stability. Officers trained under the British had internalized hierarchical discipline, and the army had been envisioned as a professional force to maintain order, not to govern. Yet, in a state where political authority remained contested and institutions fragile, the military could not remain neutral for long. It became a repository of ambition for those seeking personal advancement and a tool for leaders attempting to project strength in a volatile political climate. In this context, the figure of Idi Amin began to emerge, a man whose trajectory would soon intertwine irreversibly with the fate of the nation. Amin's early life was shaped by conditions familiar in colonial East Africa: mobility, military opportunity, and a system that rewarded loyalty and obedience more than strategic vision or political foresight. Born in 1925 in Koboko, in the northwestern reaches of Uganda, his upbringing was modest, marked by limited access to formal education and a life intimately connected to local communities and the rhythms of rural labor. Yet Amin exhibited an instinctive aptitude for survival and adaptation. The military, offering structure, mobility, and a defined path for advancement, became the arena in which he could assert himself. Enlistment in the colonial army in the early 1940s provided not only steady employment, but also exposure to broader political and social currents, discipline, and a hierarchical understanding of authority that would later define his approach to power. The post-independence period in Uganda was characterized by an uneasy balancing act. The government of Prime Minister Milton Obote attempted to navigate between regional autonomy, the demands of political factions, and the consolidation of national authority. While the nation was outwardly celebrating its newfound sovereignty, beneath the surface lay fractures that threatened stability. Ethnic rivalries, historical grievances, and competition for resources simmered quietly, occasionally erupting in localized conflicts. These pressures demanded careful negotiation and prudent governance, qualities that the young state had yet to fully cultivate. In this environment, figures like Amin were poised to leverage opportunity, not through popular mandate or political innovation, but through control of the instruments of coercion and enforcement. At this juncture, Amin was still a relatively obscure officer, but his trajectory was already shaped by the dynamics of the moment. He gained attention for his physical presence, assertiveness, and capacity to command loyalty among soldiers. Yet more significant than individual charisma was the environment in which he operated. Political volatility meant that alliances shifted rapidly, and the chain of command could become a pathway to extraordinary influence for those willing to seize it. In a nation where institutional checks were weak and party loyalties fluid, ambition coupled with opportunity could translate swiftly into decisive action. Amin exemplified this principle. He was attentive to the patterns of power around him, aware of who held authority, and ready to act when circumstances favored decisive intervention. In this sense, his rise cannot be understood solely as a product of personality. It was also the inevitable outcome of structural vulnerabilities, latent tensions, and the absence of robust mechanisms to moderate the exercise of power. The broader social context reinforced these dynamics. Uganda's population, eager for stability and improvement in living standards, was simultaneously disillusioned by unfulfilled promises and wary of elite competition. The rural majority, whose livelihoods were tied to agriculture and whose access to education and opportunity was limited, looked to leadership that could project strength and provide tangible security. Urban centers, by contrast, experienced the early stirrings of modern economic development, but also the frustrations of bureaucratic inefficiency and political uncertainty. In both spheres, the state's capacity to deliver was constrained, creating a climate in which decisive, forceful figures could be both feared and welcomed. Amin's later ability to exploit these sentiments, projecting authority, imposing order, and presenting himself as a figure who could rise above factional disputes, had its roots in this socio-political soil. At the same time, international currents exerted pressure on Uganda's trajectory. The Cold War had extended into Africa, with major powers seeking influence through aid, training, and political support. Newly independent states were viewed as strategic partners, and leaders were subtly incentivized to demonstrate stability and alignment with broader geopolitical interests. For a fragile state like Uganda, foreign attention could be a double-edged sword, providing legitimacy and resources, but also exposing weaknesses and encouraging opportunistic intervention. Amin, even before assuming the presidency, navigated this environment with an awareness of optics, reputation, and the benefits of cultivating selective alliances. He understood that power was not merely local. It resonated within a larger, international theater where appearances could bolster authority as effectively as action on the ground. Thus, the stage was set. Uganda's post-independence environment, marked by incomplete institutions, fragile political alliances, deep social disparities, and latent ethnic tensions, created conditions ripe for disruption. The military stood as both a stabilizing force and a potential instrument of upheaval. Within this context, Idi Amin's personal attributes, discipline, opportunism, charisma, and an acute sense of timing, intersected with historical circumstance to produce a trajectory that would soon alter the course of the nation. His ascent would not be a gradual accumulation of legislative power or popular support. It would be sudden, forceful, and deeply entwined with the vulnerabilities of the state itself. The significance of this period lies not merely in Amin's emergence, but in the broader lesson it offers about the interplay between personal ambition and structural fragility. Uganda's story, like that of many newly independent states, demonstrates how the combination of historical inequities, political inexperience, and social complexity can produce openings for extraordinary individuals. These openings are neither inevitable nor predetermined, yet once exploited, they can accelerate the consolidation of power in ways that outpace the development of institutions designed to moderate it. Understanding the initial conditions of Uganda's independence, the hopes, the tensions, and the unresolved legacies of colonial administration, is essential to grasping why a figure like Amin could rise with such speed and impact. In retrospect, The early 1960s in Uganda appear as a crucible, a period of fragile balance in which small decisions had outsized consequences. Leaders navigated an environment in which legitimacy was contingent, authority was contested, and the capacity to govern effectively was unevenly distributed. In such an environment, the actions of a single individual could reshape the trajectory of the nation. Amin's story during this time is not yet one of tyranny or mass violence, but of positioning, observation, and incremental influence. He moved through the ranks of the army and the corridors of power with an understanding of how to exploit weaknesses in both human and institutional frameworks. The nation, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the magnitude of change being quietly set in motion, preoccupied as it was with the promises and anxieties of independence. This period of Uganda's history underscores the delicate balance between expectation and reality in post-colonial states. Hope coexisted uneasily with vulnerability, and the pressures of nation-building demanded extraordinary vision and skill. For Amin, the combination of personal ambition and systemic opportunity created a pathway that would soon propel him to the center of power. The convergence of historical circumstance and individual action illustrates the broader truth of Uganda's early years, that independence, while a moment of collective triumph, was also a point at which latent instability could translate into profound consequence. It is within this complex, charged, and precarious landscape that the story of Idi Amin truly begins, a story in which the aspirations of a nation and the impulses of a single man intersect with devastating effect. Idi Amin's early life and military career reveal the contours of a man who would come to dominate Uganda through force, unpredictability, and a relentless drive for authority. Born in 1925 in the remote northern district of Koboko, his childhood unfolded in a region marked by marginalization and limited access to formal education. The area, largely rural and subsistence-oriented, offered few opportunities beyond traditional labor, herding, and the rhythms of village life. Yet within this environment, Amin displayed traits that would later define his public persona: resilience, a keen awareness of hierarchy, and an ability to command attention and loyalty from those around him. He was neither academically inclined nor conventionally precocious, but his intelligence was practical, adaptive, and attuned to power in its most immediate form. From these early circumstances, the patterns of his later life, observation, calculation, and a singular focus on survival, began to crystallize. Military service became the vehicle through which Amin could transcend the limitations of his origins. The colonial army, operating under the British, offered structure, discipline, and social mobility, all of which would shape his formative worldview. He joined the King's African Rifles, a regiment that served across East Africa and provided a rigorous environment for learning both obedience and strategy. In this system, Amin distinguished himself not by scholarship or diplomacy, but by physical prowess, decisiveness, and a capacity to inspire loyalty among men under his command. His advancement was aided by an innate understanding of hierarchy. He internalized the expectations of superior officers while simultaneously cultivating his influence among subordinates. This dual awareness of authority and of how to manipulate it became a hallmark of his leadership style. The army also exposed Amin to the broader structures of colonial administration, where power was centralized, impersonal, and often arbitrary. He observed the ways in which decisions were enforced not through consensus, but through discipline, coercion, and the projection of authority. These lessons were internalized with remarkable efficiency. Amin recognized that power, particularly in environments where institutional accountability was weak, depended less on formal expertise than on the ability to assert oneself decisively and command obedience. The distinction between legality and legitimacy was fluid, and he quickly learned that perception often mattered as much as procedure. In this environment, his natural aggressiveness and opportunism were not liabilities. They were assets, allowing him to maneuver within a rigid system while remaining indispensable to those in command. As the colonial period drew to a close, Amin's military experience positioned him at the intersection of personal ambition and historical opportunity. Uganda's independence in 1962 created a vacuum in which military figures could exercise influence far beyond their rank. The nascent state lacked entrenched institutions capable of mediating power disputes, and political authority was contested among multiple parties and regional interests. In such a context, officers like Amin were uniquely poised to leverage personal relationships, loyalty networks, and the implicit threat of force to shape outcomes. His rise, therefore, was not solely a product of individual talent. It was the consequence of structural vulnerabilities inherent in a state transitioning from colonial rule to self-governance. The army, designed initially as a neutral instrument of national defense, became a theater for personal advancement and political leverage. Within this framework, Amin's personality and method of operation began to take shape. He combined charisma with unpredictability, a capacity for extreme violence with a performance of jocular confidence. Colleagues described him as engaging, entertaining, and often disarmingly humorous, traits that fostered loyalty and mitigated suspicion. Yet these qualities coexisted with a ruthless streak, a willingness to intimidate or eliminate those who stood in his way, and a proclivity for consolidating power around himself. His duality, amiable in public, ruthless in private, allowed him to navigate a complex military hierarchy while quietly positioning himself for eventual dominance. It was a style that would later become emblematic of his regime. The unpredictable strongman, whose charm disarmed observers even as his actions sowed terror. The early 1960s also exposed Amin to the broader social and political currents shaping Uganda. The nation's post-independence trajectory was uncertain. Political factions competed for dominance, ethnic identities influenced allegiance, and economic disparities created tension. Within the army, these same dynamics played out on a microcosmic level. Officers aligned along ethnic lines, regional loyalty influenced promotion, and patronage networks determined access to power and resources. Amin navigated these complexities with skill, cultivating relationships across divisions while exploiting rivalries to strengthen his position. His strategy was neither ideological nor visionary. It was pragmatic, rooted in a keen understanding of human behavior and the mechanics of influence. Amin's rise was further facilitated by the psychological and structural environment of the army itself. Discipline was enforced with severity, and loyalty was paramount. Officers who challenged authority risked punishment or ostracism, while those who demonstrated obedience and effectiveness could ascend rapidly. Amin internalized this system and then mastered it, using both formal authority and informal influence to build a personal base within the military. By fostering a sense of dependence among subordinates, he created loyalty that was as much about survival as it was about admiration. Those who served under him came to recognize that allegiance was not optional. It was a condition for continued existence within the regiment. In this way, Amin honed the techniques of control that would later define his rule over an entire nation. Another critical aspect of Amin's early career was his exposure to international military practices and alliances. The British, who continued to influence Uganda's military affairs after independence, provided training and operational guidance. Amin absorbed these lessons selectively, learning both conventional tactics and the art of bureaucratic maneuvering. At the same time, he developed an awareness of the optics of power, recognizing that external perceptions could reinforce domestic authority. He understood that appearances mattered. A display of decisiveness, physical vigor, or loyalty could consolidate influence without the need for formal legislation or institutional sanction. This awareness of both domestic and international dimensions of authority would later become a defining characteristic of his approach to governance. While Amin's individual trajectory was accelerating, the broader state remained fragile. The political leadership, led by Milton Obote, faced continuous pressure to maintain national cohesion, while managing the competing demands of ethnicity, regionalism, and party politics. In such an environment, the army was a powerful actor capable of intervening in ways that could reshape governance. Amin's positioning within this structure was strategic. He cultivated visibility, influence, and perceived indispensability, all while remaining under the radar of civilian political leaders. This dual approach, prominent enough to be recognized, subtle enough to avoid premature confrontation, demonstrates his acute understanding of timing and opportunity. The combination of personal traits, military experience, and structural conditions set the stage for Amin's eventual seizure of power. His upbringing in a marginalized region instilled resilience and adaptability. His military training provided discipline, strategic awareness, and hierarchical insight, and the political fragility of post-independence Uganda offered openings that a figure of his talents could exploit. Together, these factors created a convergence of ambition and opportunity, positioning him to ascend rapidly once circumstances aligned. It was a trajectory that blended preparation with circumstance, opportunism with structural advantage, and personal charisma with institutional weakness. Finally, Amin's early career illustrates the broader lesson of historical causality. Individual agency interacts with social and structural forces in ways that produce outcomes neither fully predictable nor inevitable. His rise was not a foregone conclusion. Many of his contemporaries in the military and political spheres possessed similar traits or advantages. Yet Amin combined them in a singularly effective manner, leveraging loyalty, fear, and strategic timing to achieve ascendancy. The early 1960s thus serve as both a prelude and a lens. They reveal the conditions that allowed a single man to rise, and they illuminate the vulnerabilities of a nation in transition, where opportunity and instability intersect with enduring consequences. In this phase of his life, Amin's story is not yet one of tyranny, mass violence, or international infamy. It is a story of positioning, observation, and incremental influence. It is the story of a man learning the mechanics of power in a society where institutions were fragile, alliances were fluid, and the stakes of authority were existential. The lessons of these years, about ambition, adaptation, and the exploitation of structural weakness, would reverberate through the decades to come, shaping not only the fate of Uganda, but also the contours of modern African history. Amin's early military career, therefore, is both a study in individual psychology and a reflection of the broader dynamics of a nation finding its footing amid the challenges of post-colonial statehood. It is within this crucible of circumstance, skill, and opportunity that the rise of Idi Amin begins in earnest, setting the stage for the unprecedented impact he would soon have on Uganda and the wider world. The sudden seizure of power by Idi Amin in January 1971 was as swift as it was decisive, a moment that transformed Uganda from a fragile post-independence state into a theater dominated by one man's authority. The political landscape of the country had been volatile for years, characterized by fragile coalitions, ethnic tensions, and a constant threat of military intervention. Milton Obote, the sitting prime minister and later president, had pursued policies aimed at consolidating power, often at the expense of political rivals and regional constituencies. This approach generated deep resentment among certain sectors of the military and within communities that felt marginalized or threatened by centralization. Amin, ever observant and opportunistic, recognized that the convergence of political dissatisfaction and institutional weakness created the ideal conditions for decisive action. His rise to power was not merely the result of personal ambition. It was the inevitable consequence of structural vulnerabilities that had been accumulating since independence. The coup itself was executed with remarkable precision. Unlike the chaotic overthrows that often marred the continent during this period, Amin's takeover demonstrated careful planning, coordination, and timing. Units loyal to him were strategically positioned to neutralize potential resistance, both within the army and across the administrative apparatus. Key figures aligned with Obote were isolated or removed before they could mount an effective countermeasure. The absence of significant bloodshed during the initial phase of the coup underscored the efficiency of Amin's operation. The transfer of power appeared almost seamless, leaving many Ugandans in a state of stunned uncertainty. This abruptness reinforced the perception that the army, and by extension Amin himself, was the ultimate arbiter of authority, a perception that would shape political culture for the years to come. At the heart of Amin's takeover was a calculated appeal to both fear and pragmatism. He presented himself not as a revolutionary seeking radical transformation, but as a stabilizing force, capable of restoring order to a nation that had grown weary of political infighting and economic uncertainty. This framing was critical. It allowed him to consolidate authority without immediate widespread opposition. Citizens and military personnel alike interpreted the coup as a corrective measure rather than a rupture of legitimate governance, a perception that would later prove instrumental in maintaining his grip on power during the early months of his rule. Amin's understanding of optics and narrative was already apparent. He knew that authority depended not only on control of institutions, but also on the perception of legitimacy among those who lived under his command. The immediate consequences of the coup revealed the fragility of Uganda's post-independence institutions. The civilian bureaucracy, already weakened by years of contested governance and resource scarcity, was ill-equipped to respond to the sudden shift in power. Government ministries, regional administrations, and local councils found themselves subordinate to military directives, creating a system in which decisions flowed downward from Amin with minimal consultation or deliberation. This centralization reflected his instinctual approach to authority. Control was concentrated in the hands of a single individual, and loyalty was enforced through personal allegiance rather than formal procedure. Institutions that might have served as stabilizing counterweights were either co-opted or rendered ineffective, demonstrating how the collapse of procedural governance can accelerate the concentration of power in a post-colonial state. Amin's assumption of control also revealed the inherent tension between the appearance of strength and the reality of governing. While the initial phase of his rule was marked by decisive action and a sense of momentum, the underlying challenges of administration persisted. Uganda's economy remained fragile, social divisions were unresolved, and external pressures from neighboring states, former colonial powers, and emerging Cold War dynamics continued to influence domestic affairs. Amin's leadership style, rooted in instinct, improvisation, and reliance on personal loyalty, allowed him to manage immediate threats, but did not address the structural weaknesses that had long plagued the nation. In this sense, the coup was both an act of empowerment and a moment of exposure. It showcased his capacity for rapid, assertive action while highlighting the enduring complexities of governance that could not be resolved by force alone. The military, as both the instrument and beneficiary of Amin's power, became central to the consolidation of authority. Officers and enlisted personnel who demonstrated loyalty were rewarded with promotion, resources, and influence, while those perceived as threats were marginalized, removed, or coerced into compliance. This system of selective empowerment reinforced the personalization of power. The state became inseparable from Amin himself, and obedience was equated with survival. Within the army, as across civilian society, the boundaries between institutional procedure and individual discretion blurred. Decisions that might previously have required consultation, negotiation, or legal sanction were now mediated through personal allegiance, loyalty, and fear. This restructuring of authority, while effective in the short term, sowed the seeds of future instability, as the concentration of power in a single figure left the nation vulnerable to erratic decision-making and capricious judgment. Amin's consolidation of power also relied on careful manipulation of perception and symbolism. Public appearances, speeches, and ceremonial acts were used to project confidence, decisiveness, and legitimacy. He cultivated an image of a strongman capable of transcending factional politics and ethnic divisions, even as the realities of his rule began to favor certain groups over others. The spectacle of power, as much as its execution, became a tool of governance. This dual emphasis on action and appearance reinforced the sense that authority was absolute and unchallengeable, a perception that both stabilized and constrained the early years of his regime. Citizens and observers were left to reconcile the outward show of control with the internal fragility of institutions, creating a tension that would define the character of Amin's governance for the next decade. Yet even as Amin secured his position, the underlying social and political dynamics of Uganda did not vanish. Ethnic divisions, regional grievances, and competing political loyalties persisted, creating latent pressures that would later erupt in violence and repression. The military, while loyal in appearance, contained factions and interests that could challenge authority if left unchecked. Civilian administrators, once reliant on formal procedures, had to navigate a new environment in which decisions were dictated by proximity to the ruler rather than adherence to law or policy. The interplay between individual authority and structural weakness became increasingly pronounced, revealing the limits of rule by force and the vulnerabilities inherent in personalistic governance. Amin's early consolidation of power was impressive in its rapidity and efficiency, but it was a prelude to the systemic challenges that would define his regime in subsequent years. The economic dimensions of Amin's takeover were equally consequential. Uganda's economy, already fragile due to structural inefficiencies, dependency on export commodities, and uneven development, was suddenly subordinated to the imperatives of survival and control. Resources were allocated according to loyalty rather than productivity or strategic planning, creating distortions that undermined long-term stability. This early phase of rule demonstrated a key pattern that would recur throughout Amin's leadership. Short-term expedience often took precedence over sustainable policy, and immediate control was valued above institutional strength or economic coherence. The consequences of this approach, while not fully apparent in the initial months, set the stage for subsequent crises in governance, social welfare, and national cohesion. Amin's personal style of leadership, forged during years of military service and opportunistic navigation of political structures, became increasingly visible in the days and months following the coup. Decision-making was centralized, often impulsive, and informed by instinct rather than consultation. Fear was a tool of compliance, loyalty a currency of power. Yet alongside these methods, Amin displayed a performative dimension that complicated simple characterizations of tyranny. He cultivated humor, theatricality, and ostentation, which both endeared him to certain constituencies and confounded observers seeking to predict his behavior. This duality, simultaneously charismatic and terrifying, allowed him to consolidate authority with minimal resistance in the early stages of his regime, even as the underlying fragility of governance persisted. The 1971 coup and its aftermath thus illustrate the complex interplay of opportunity, preparation, and structural weakness. Amin's ascent was facilitated by his personal skills, his understanding of the military as an instrument of power, and the vulnerabilities inherent in Uganda's nascent institutions. It was also enabled by the broader socio-political environment. A population weary of instability, political elites divided by faction and region, and a state unprepared to mediate power disputes through formal channels. The convergence of these factors created a moment in which decisive, forceful action could reshape the nation almost overnight. Amin's seizure of power was not merely an event. It was a crystallization of historical forces, personal ambition, and structural vulnerabilities that had been accumulating since the country's independence. In retrospect, the 1971 takeover represents a pivotal moment in Uganda's history. It marked the transition from a fragile post-colonial experiment to a regime defined by personalistic authority, military dominance, and centralized control. Amin's methods, rooted in observation, opportunism, and instinct, allowed him to exploit the structural weaknesses of the state and the loyalties of the military to achieve dominance. The efficiency and decisiveness of the coup concealed the deeper vulnerabilities that would later manifest in economic decline, social upheaval, and widespread repression. Understanding this moment is essential to comprehending the trajectory of Amin's rule. It reveals the conditions that allowed a single individual to reshape an entire nation, and it foreshadows the challenges, contradictions, and consequences that would characterize Uganda under his authority for the years to come. The early months of Amin's rule revealed the contours of his governing style with striking clarity. Unlike leaders who rely on bureaucratic structures, policy frameworks, or ideological programs, Amin's approach was instinctual, improvisational, and intensely personal. Decisions were rarely the product of consultation or strategic deliberation. They flowed from his immediate perceptions, his interpretation of loyalty and threat, and his sense of how authority should be exercised. This governing style allowed for swift action and visible displays of power, yet it also exposed the fragility of the institutions over which he presided. Ministries, local administrations, and civil services were subordinated to a central figure whose judgment, while decisive, was capricious and unpredictable. The very structures designed to mediate authority became extensions of his personal will, operating less as checks and balances than as instruments of obedience and surveillance. Amin's early governance was marked by a consolidation of power that blurred the boundaries between the state and the individual. He surrounded himself with a network of loyalists, many drawn from his own ethnic background or from units within the military that had supported him during the coup. Positions of authority were distributed not according to merit, expertise, or institutional need, but according to personal allegiance. This created a hierarchy in which obedience was rewarded and dissent punished, and it transformed the machinery of government into a system of patronage. The army, already central to the seizure of power, became the backbone of this new structure, not only enforcing directives, but also acting as a repository of political legitimacy. The state, in effect, became a projection of Amin himself, with all its authority, power, and resources flowing outward from the man at its center. The consolidation of power also required a careful management of perception. Amin understood that authority depends not merely on capacity, but on the appearance of inevitability. He projected an image of confidence, decisiveness, and control, using public ceremonies, speeches, and symbolic gestures to signal his dominance. At the same time, he cultivated an air of unpredictability that kept potential rivals off balance. Subordinates, political allies, and even ordinary citizens learned to read his moods and anticipate his reactions, recognizing that adherence to his expectations was not optional. In this environment, fear and admiration became intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Loyalty was cultivated as much through uncertainty and the threat of punishment as through charisma or persuasion, a dynamic that would become a defining feature of his rule. One of the most immediate consequences of Amin's governing style was the erosion of institutional authority. Ministries that had functioned, however imperfectly, under prior administrations were now reduced to instruments of enforcement rather than deliberation. Policy decisions were made on the basis of expedience, loyalty, or personal whim, rather than through consultation, evidence, or long-term planning. Civil servants who resisted or questioned directives faced dismissal, intimidation, or worse, creating an environment in which compliance was prioritized over competence. Over time, this approach undermined the capacity of the state to deliver services, manage resources, or enforce laws impartially. The very structures intended to stabilize governance were hollowed out, leaving the nation increasingly dependent on the arbitrary decisions of a single individual. Amin's approach to power was also deeply intertwined with a reconfiguration of social and political hierarchies. Ethnicity, personal loyalty, and military service became the primary criteria for advancement and protection, supplanting meritocratic or institutional norms. This reshaping of authority created new inequalities and dependencies, embedding favoritism into the very fabric of governance. Groups aligned with the regime received protection, resources, and opportunity, while those perceived as threats or outsiders faced exclusion, marginalization, or persecution. Over time, this dynamic not only reinforced Amin's personal power, but also intensified social fragmentation, creating fault lines that would later erupt in violence and unrest. The centralization of authority around a single personality, combined with selective empowerment and exclusion, transformed Uganda's political landscape into a highly personalized and unpredictable system of rule. Amin's early rule was also characterized by reliance on the military as both enforcer and legitimizer. The army was no longer merely a protector of national sovereignty. It became the instrument through which political authority was exercised, extended, and symbolically represented. Officers loyal to Amin were granted extraordinary autonomy and privileges, creating a culture in which obedience was rewarded with power and disobedience punished with severity. The military centrality in governance blurred the line between national defense and political repression, embedding a culture of fear and coercion within the structures of authority. This militarization of the state not only facilitated rapid consolidation of power, but also entrenched patterns of control that would persist throughout Amin's tenure, shaping the way governance was experienced at every level of society. Another defining feature of Amin's governing style was the use of public spectacle to consolidate authority. Ceremonies, speeches, and highly visible demonstrations of force served multiple purposes. They reinforced the perception of power, signaled loyalty, and created an aura of inevitability around his decisions. The performance of authority became as important as the execution of policy, shaping perceptions both domestically and internationally. Citizens were encouraged to internalize the image of a decisive, omnipresent leader whose will could not be challenged. This performative aspect of governance, coupled with the concentration of power and the erosion of institutional autonomy, reinforced the personalization of authority and the centrality of Amin's persona in the political imagination of the nation. The social implications of Amin's style of governance were profound. Ordinary citizens, previously accustomed to navigating bureaucratic systems and legal procedures, now faced a reality in which decisions were arbitrary, enforcement was uneven, and survival often depended on personal connections or compliance with unpredictable authority. The centralization of power around Amin, combined with the use of fear and spectacle, created a climate of uncertainty in which social behavior was shaped by anticipation of the ruler's preferences. Communities adapted to these conditions through caution, self-censorship, and realignment of loyalties. Social cohesion, already fragile in a post-colonial context marked by ethnic and regional divisions, was further strained as trust in institutions eroded and dependence on individual patronage networks intensified. Amin's governing style also had profound economic consequences. Resources were allocated according to loyalty rather than need or efficiency, undermining the capacity of the state to manage public goods or stimulate productive activity. Economic decisions were often reactive, improvisational, or symbolic, designed to demonstrate control rather than to promote sustainable development. The early months of rule revealed a pattern that would persist. Short-term expedience, centralized control, and prioritization of political loyalty over structural integrity. These patterns eroded the economic foundations of governance, producing inefficiencies, distortions, and growing inequities that would have long-term consequences for national stability and development. While his methods were effective in consolidating immediate power, Amin's reliance on instinct, improvisation, and fear created vulnerabilities that would later become apparent. The personalization of authority, the erosion of institutions, and the dependence on loyalty networks made decision-making highly contingent on his presence and judgment. Subordinates were empowered to act, but only insofar as their actions aligned with his will, creating a fragile equilibrium in which a single misjudgment could have cascading consequences. In this environment, governance was reactive rather than strategic, improvisational rather than disciplined, and highly sensitive to fluctuations in the ruler's perception and temperament. Ultimately, the early phase of Amin's rule illustrates the dynamics of personalistic governance in a post-colonial context. Authority is concentrated, institutions are subordinated, loyalty is enforced through fear and patronage, and the performative aspects of power are elevated to strategic importance. The consequences for the state, its institutions, and its citizens are profound. Governance becomes unpredictable, social cohesion is weakened, and economic and administrative systems are distorted to serve the imperatives of immediate control. Amin's approach, while effective in consolidating power quickly, embeds structural weaknesses that will shape the trajectory of the nation for years to come. These formative months also provide insight into the psychological and operational logic of a leader who governs by instinct and intimidation. Amin's methods reflect a profound understanding of human behavior, organizational dynamics, and the ways in which authority can be perceived, manipulated, and enforced. He recognizes that obedience can be secured as much through fear and spectacle as through persuasion, and he applies this insight systematically across the military, the bureaucracy, and society at large. Yet this logic is inherently unstable. It relies on constant reinforcement, continuous surveillance, and the alignment of perception with personal authority. The early months of Amin's rule demonstrate both the efficacy and the inherent fragility of such a system, revealing how consolidation of power can be achieved quickly, yet maintained only precariously. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that Amin's governance was neither accidental nor purely reactive. It was the result of accumulated experience, opportunistic insight, and a deliberate approach to authority shaped by both his personal history and the structural conditions of post-independence Uganda. His reliance on instinct, improvisation, and loyalty networks was both a strategy and a necessity, given the weaknesses of the state and the volatility of political life. The result is a governing style that is immediate, forceful, and highly personalized, yet also deeply vulnerable to the systemic stresses it creates. These early months thus set the tone for the years to come, establishing patterns of authority, fear, and spectacle that would define Amin's rule and shape the lives of millions of Ugandans in profound and enduring ways. As Amin's rule settled into its early rhythm, the centrality of the military in governance became increasingly evident. The army was no longer merely a defensive institution tasked with protecting national borders or maintaining internal order. It became the foundation upon which the state itself rested. Every significant decision, from administrative appointments to economic interventions, was mediated through the lens of military loyalty. Officers and enlisted personnel were rewarded not primarily for competence or expertise, but for their allegiance to Amin, creating a system in which personal devotion to the ruler equated to political and material advantage. This militarization of authority transformed the very nature of governance. The state's operations were inseparable from the imperatives of the armed forces, and the chain of command within the army became a surrogate for institutional oversight across civilian administration. The expansion of military influence had immediate and long-term consequences. On a structural level, civil institutions that might have served as stabilizing forces were subordinated to the priorities of the armed forces. Ministries, local governments, and bureaucratic departments found themselves accountable not to legal frameworks, policy objectives, or even national interests, but to the dictates of military authority. Decisions that once required consultation or deliberation could now be enacted with a simple directive from a loyal officer or from Amin himself. This centralization of power created efficiency in execution, yet it simultaneously eroded the checks and balances essential to responsible governance. The state became an extension of the military, and the military became an extension of Amin, blurring distinctions between civil and martial authority in ways that would prove destabilizing over time. Within the military itself, Amin's consolidation of power reshaped hierarchies and fostered a culture of personal loyalty. Promotions, assignments, and opportunities for advancement were distributed according to perceived fidelity to the regime rather than merit or experience. Officers who demonstrated unquestioning loyalty were rewarded with material benefits, enhanced status, and influence over local and national affairs, while those suspected of disloyalty were marginalized, threatened, or removed entirely. This system encouraged competition, suspicion, and opportunism, reinforcing a climate in which the demonstration of obedience was paramount. The army, ostensibly a professional institution, became a network of patronage and fear, where political survival depended on proximity to the center of power and the ability to anticipate a mean's expectations. The effects of militarization extended beyond the army into society at large. Ordinary citizens experience governance increasingly through the presence of armed forces and the enforcement of military authority in everyday life. Security forces were omnipresent, and their actions, ranging from inspection and oversight to intimidation and coercion, signaled the dominance of military authority over civil structures. Economic transactions, local disputes, and political activity were all mediated through the lens of enforcement. Communities adjusted their behavior in response to the pervasive influence of armed power, learning to navigate a social environment in which compliance was often enforced through fear rather than consensus or legal mandate. The militarization of the state thus reshaped both governance and the lived experience of citizens, embedding the army deeply into the social, economic, and political fabric of the nation. Amin's reliance on the military also served a symbolic purpose. The visible presence of troops, the display of uniforms, and the orchestration of ceremonial events reinforced the perception of authority and inevitability. The army was not merely a tool of enforcement. It was a symbol of state power, a demonstration of strength intended to legitimize and normalize the concentration of authority in a single individual. Citizens, politicians, and international observers alike were encouraged to interpret the prominence of military force as a measure of stability and decisiveness, even as underlying institutional weaknesses persisted. This intertwining of performance and power became a defining feature of Amin's rule, establishing a precedent in which perception and spectacle were as critical as action in consolidating authority. At the same time, the expansion of military influence had profound consequences for social cohesion. The allocation of authority, resources, and protection through loyalty networks created new hierarchies of privilege and exclusion. Communities aligned with the regime benefited from security, economic opportunity, and access to decision-making, while those perceived as hostile or marginal were increasingly vulnerable. Ethnic, regional, and personal affiliations were amplified in the distribution of power, intensifying social stratification and creating fault lines within the population. Trust in institutions eroded as state functions became personalized and dependent on military oversight. In this environment, social behavior was governed less by law, custom, or community consensus than by the anticipation of the ruler's judgment and the reach of military enforcement. The militarization of governance also had significant economic implications. Resources were allocated and decisions executed in accordance with loyalty networks rather than systemic planning or efficiency. Infrastructure projects, trade policies, and industrial initiatives were often designed to reward allies or assert control rather than to achieve long-term economic stability. The army itself became a major consumer and distributor of resources, drawing manpower, funding, and logistical support away from civil sectors and toward the sustenance of loyalty and enforcement. This pattern of resource allocation reinforced the centrality of the military in all aspects of governance while undermining the capacity of the state to function independently or sustainably. Economic distortions, inefficiencies, and inequities were not merely incidental. They were structural consequences of a governance model anchored in militarized authority. The culture within the army, molded by Amin's leadership, was one of fear, ambition, and opportunism. Officers were trained not only in military tactics, but also in the political logic of loyalty, obedience, and survival. Subordinates learned to anticipate the ruler's mood, align themselves with perceived favorites, and navigate shifting allegiances to avoid sanction. The socialization of military personnel in this environment reinforced the centralization of authority, creating a feedback loop in which obedience to Amin was both a condition for survival and a path to advancement. Over time, this dynamic eroded professional norms, replacing institutional competence with political calculation and personal loyalty. The army, while outwardly disciplined, became an instrument of arbitrary authority, reflecting the personal whims and strategic calculations of its leader rather than the collective priorities of the state or society. As military dominance intensified, Amin's control over civilian administration followed a parallel trajectory. Governors, ministers, and civil servants were increasingly subordinated to officers, who acted as intermediaries between the ruler and the population. Authority flowed vertically, and decisions were mediated less through established procedures than through personal networks and the expectations of loyalty. Civil administration became a shadow of its former self, operating under the constant oversight of military authority and the implicit threat of coercion. The result was a state apparatus that appeared functional on the surface. Orders were executed, directives enforced, but lacked the independent capacity, accountability, or strategic coherence that characterize resilient governance. The state's effectiveness became contingent on the immediate presence and judgment of a single individual and his enforcers, embedding fragility into every level of administration. Internationally, the militarization of the state shaped Uganda's relationships with foreign powers. Diplomatic engagements, trade negotiations, and aid allocations were often influenced by perceptions of strength and control rather than policy coherence or institutional reliability. Amin's projection of military power signaled both stability and unpredictability, eliciting cautious accommodation from foreign actors. The symbolic and practical centrality of the military thus extended beyond domestic governance, influencing Uganda's position in regional and global politics. Observers interpreted the concentration of force as a measure of authority, even as the underlying vulnerabilities of institutions, economy, and society persisted. The militarization of governance also heightened the stakes of internal opposition. Political rivals, civil leaders, or regional authorities who might have contested Amin's authority were deterred not only by fear of personal reprisal, but by the pervasive presence of armed enforcers. Resistance required confronting a network of loyalty that was deeply embedded in both military and civilian structures. Over time, this dynamic suppressed overt political contestation, enabling the regime to consolidate control, but it also intensified the underlying tensions that would later surface in crises of loyalty, rebellion, and instability. The consolidation of power through militarization, while effective in the short term, created a brittle equilibrium dependent on continuous reinforcement and surveillance. Ultimately, the centralization and militarization of authority under Amin established patterns that would define his rule for the next decade. The army became the principal instrument of both governance and legitimacy, subordinating institutions, mediating loyalty, and projecting power through both action and spectacle. Civil administration, economy, and society were increasingly shaped by the imperatives of personal loyalty and military enforcement, rather than procedural law or institutional capacity. The interplay between force, fear, and performance created a governance model that was immediately effective in consolidating authority, but deeply vulnerable to the distortions, inefficiencies, and social fractures it generated. The expansion of military influence was both a strategy of control and a defining feature of Amin's regime, setting the tone for the complex, often catastrophic consequences that would follow. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the militarization of the state under Amin was more than a tactical response to immediate political circumstances. It was a deliberate and systematic transformation of governance, one in which authority, loyalty, and survival were intertwined with the presence and exercise of force. Institutions were hollowed out, civil authority subordinated, and social hierarchies reshaped according to the imperatives of obedience. The consequences were structural, cultural, and economic, embedding patterns of control, inequality, and fragility that would shape Uganda's trajectory long after the initial consolidation of power. Amin's early reliance on the military thus illuminates the mechanics of personalistic rule, the transformation of a state into an instrument of one man's authority, reinforced by loyalty, spectacle, and the pervasive shadow of armed force. As Amin's rule consolidated, The emergence of perceived enemies, both real and imagined, became a defining characteristic of governance. The early months of his presidency revealed the fragility of power built on fear and loyalty, where the slightest hint of disloyalty could provoke decisive, often brutal, action. Individuals within the military, civil administration, and political elite were scrutinized not only for their competence or performance, but for their proximity to potential threats. Those who failed to demonstrate unequivocal allegiance were swiftly marginalized, removed from positions of authority, or subjected to intimidation. This climate of suspicion extended beyond official circles, permeating society at large, where even ordinary citizens became acutely aware that survival depended on alignment with the ruler's expectations. The perception of threat, whether grounded in fact or fabricated, became a central mechanism through which power was exercised and maintained. The creation of enemies served multiple functions. On one level, it justified the concentration of authority and the centralization of decision-making. By identifying threats, whether they were rival officers, political factions, or dissenting civil servants, Amin could frame the narrative of governance as a struggle against instability and subversion. This framing allowed extraordinary measures, including purges, arrests, and dismissals, to be presented as necessary for the survival of the state rather than the personal consolidation of power. Citizens and observers were encouraged to interpret these actions not as arbitrary or capricious, but as deliberate efforts to secure national stability. In effect, the perception of enemies became a tool to legitimize both authority and the methods by which it was enforced, intertwining fear with governance in a way that reinforced Amin's dominance. Within the military, the identification of enemies was both strategic and performative. Officers who were perceived as threats due to personal ambition, factional loyalty, or regional alignment were isolated, reassigned, or eliminated. Simultaneously, the demonstration of loyalty became a performative act. Subordinates were expected to signal allegiance publicly, to participate in purges or denunciations, and to display commitment to Amin's authority in ways that reinforced the hierarchy of fear. The army, already central to the state's functioning, became the primary vehicle for the enforcement of these perceptions. Loyalty was both tested and rewarded, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior were constantly recalibrated in response to the ruler's perception of threat. In this environment, political survival required not only competence, but an acute sensitivity to power, hierarchy, and the mutable nature of authority. Amin's identification of enemies was not confined to the military. Civil administration, political organizations, and regional authorities were similarly scrutinized. Ministers, governors, and bureaucrats were judged by their proximity to dissent or opposition, and even the appearance of disloyalty could be sufficient grounds for removal or punishment. The resulting climate was one of pervasive insecurity. Officials operated under constant pressure to anticipate the ruler's expectations and to demonstrate proactive loyalty. Decisions were no longer evaluated solely on merit or policy coherence. They were measured by alignment with Amin's perception of authority and threat. This approach transformed the bureaucratic apparatus into an instrument of surveillance, compliance, and control, further centralizing power around a single individual while eroding institutional resilience. The impact of these dynamics on society was profound. Ordinary citizens, keenly attuned to the consequences of misalignment with authority, adapted their behavior to mitigate risk. Networks of informants, public denunciations, and community monitoring emerged, creating a culture in which suspicion became normalized and trust diminished. Families, colleagues, and neighbors became potential vectors of accusation, and social interactions were increasingly mediated by the perceived risk of transgression. The identification of enemies, real or imagined, was thus not only a tool of elite consolidation. It reshaped social norms, behavioral expectations, and the rhythms of daily life. Fear became an organizing principle, structuring both political engagement and personal conduct in ways that reinforced the ruler's authority. Economically, The focus on enemies influenced the distribution of resources and opportunities. Favor was concentrated among those who demonstrated unwavering loyalty, while groups or individuals perceived as potentially subversive faced marginalization or exclusion. Investments, administrative appointments, and access to material support were contingent on allegiance, creating a system in which political reliability outweighed technical competence. This approach produced inefficiencies, misallocation of resources, and distortions in governance, but it simultaneously reinforced the centrality of the ruler's judgment and the imperative of loyalty. Economic policy and opportunity were subordinated to the logic of surveillance and control, embedding structural fragility into the very foundations of state administration. The psychological dimensions of Amin's strategy were equally significant. By cultivating a pervasive sense of threat, he ensured that loyalty was constantly reinforced and that potential rivals were hesitant to act independently. The constant presence of fear amplified the perception of authority, making the exercise of power appear both inevitable and unchallengeable. Yet this psychological landscape was inherently unstable. It depended on continuous reinforcement, constant vigilance, and the calibration of threat to maintain obedience. A single lapse, a misperception, or an unexpected challenge could destabilize the carefully maintained equilibrium. In this way, the creation of enemies both strengthened immediate control and generated latent vulnerabilities, establishing a tension that would recur throughout Amin's rule. The systematic targeting of perceived enemies also had moral and ethical dimensions that reshaped Uganda's political culture. Governance by suspicion eroded norms of accountability, due process, and fairness. Individuals were judged not by objective criteria or performance, but by proximity to threat and the subjective assessment of loyalty. This reconfiguration of moral and political evaluation created a feedback loop in which fear dictated behavior. Loyalty was performative, and survival required constant vigilance. Over time, these dynamics undermined the social contract, transforming the relationship between ruler and citizen into one mediated by coercion, surveillance, and the implicit threat of violence. The identification of enemies became both a mechanism of control and a lens through which the moral order of governance was redefined. Externally, the identification of threats influenced Uganda's diplomatic posture and international relations. Foreign observers, diplomats, and governments were forced to navigate a landscape in which the internal logic of authority was opaque, contingent, and often unpredictable. Decisions regarding alliances, aid, or negotiation were interpreted through the lens of perceived loyalty and control, creating uncertainty and caution in international engagement. Amin's projection of authority, reinforced by the identification of internal enemies, thus had both domestic and global ramifications, shaping perceptions of Uganda's stability, reliability, and predictability in ways that would have long-term consequences for foreign policy and economic interaction. The cumulative effect of this climate of fear and surveillance was to create a governance system in which authority was both absolute and fragile. Amin's personal dominance was reinforced by the perception of constant threat, yet this very reliance on fear generated structural vulnerabilities. The system required continuous enforcement, constant monitoring of loyalty, and the active management of perceptions. Any disruption, whether through internal dissent, external pressure, or miscalculation, had the potential to unravel the delicate equilibrium. In this sense, the creation of enemies was both a source of strength and a point of systemic fragility, embedding instability into the very mechanisms that sustain power. Ultimately, the emergence of enemies, real and imagined, serve as a central mechanism in the consolidation and exercise of power. It allowed Amin to justify extraordinary measures, reinforce loyalty, and centralize authority, while simultaneously reshaping social norms, institutional function, and political culture. The identification and management of threat became inseparable from the exercise of governance, influencing decisions across military, civil, and social spheres. This approach created a state in which obedience, vigilance, and fear were paramount, establishing patterns that would shape Uganda's trajectory for years to come. Amin's early strategy of targeting enemies demonstrates the intricate interplay between perception, authority, and control, illustrating how the deliberate cultivation of fear can both stabilize and destabilize a regime, often with profound consequences for the nation it governs. By the middle of Amin's first year in power, Uganda was beginning to feel the profound consequences of the centralization of authority and the militarization of governance. The state, previously fragile but functioning within familiar bureaucratic constraints, had transformed into an apparatus dominated by a single individual whose decisions were absolute, immediate, and often unpredictable. The effects were felt across every layer of society. In the corridors of government, where ministries operated under the shadow of military enforcement. In local communities, where ordinary citizens navigated a landscape of fear and uncertainty. And in the economy, where allocation of resources was dictated more by loyalty than necessity or efficiency. Amin's Uganda was a nation in which governance was personalized, authority performative, and survival contingent on perception. One of the most striking aspects of this phase of Amin's rule was the profound erosion of institutional norms. Civil institutions that had previously served as stabilizing forces, ministries, councils, and administrative bodies, were now subordinated to the imperatives of personal loyalty and military enforcement. Decisions were executed through vertical chains of command, often bypassing procedural checks and mechanisms designed to ensure accountability. Ministers and officials found their authority circumscribed by the presence of military intermediaries, whose judgment reflected not the rules of law but the perceived will of the president. In this environment, institutional memory, expertise, and procedural continuity were secondary to the demonstration of alignment with Amin's expectations. The machinery of governance became an extension of personal power, highly efficient in execution, but increasingly brittle in function. The concentration of authority also reshaped the dynamics of fear and loyalty. Officers within the military and officials within the civil administration were required to constantly demonstrate fidelity, anticipating the ruler's moods and aligning their actions accordingly. Any perceived deviation from loyalty could provoke demotion, reassignment, or more severe consequences. This environment fostered hypervigilance, opportunism, and an acute sensitivity to political signals. Obedience was performative, loyalty transactional, and survival dependent on the ability to navigate shifting hierarchies. The interplay between fear and incentive created a system in which compliance was secured not through consensus or persuasion, but through anticipation of the ruler's perception of threat. Authority became both omnipresent and intangible, anchored in perception as much as in action. Within society at large, the impact of this system was equally profound. Ordinary citizens adapted to a reality in which the state's power was exercised with immediacy and unpredictability. Surveillance, denunciation, and public displays of loyalty became routine, shaping social behavior and interaction. Communities learned to navigate a world where allegiances were scrutinized, trust was provisional, and the consequences of misalignment could be severe. The identification of enemies, both real and imagined, reinforced social hierarchies, privileging those aligned with the regime while marginalizing or endangering those perceived as disloyal. In this climate, the personal calculus of safety and survival dictated daily life, restructuring social norms and redefining the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Economically, the centralization of authority and the emphasis on loyalty had immediate consequences. Resource allocation, industrial oversight, and infrastructure projects were increasingly subordinated to considerations of allegiance and compliance. Ministries responsible for planning and economic management operated under the constraints of personalist rule, with decisions reflecting the priorities of the president rather than systemic efficiency or strategic necessity. This approach introduced distortions, inefficiencies, and inequities into the management of public goods, embedding structural fragility into the economy. At the same time, it reinforced the perception that control over resources was inseparable from proximity to power, further entrenching networks of patronage and dependence on loyalty rather than merit. Amin's governance during this period also highlighted the performative aspects of authority. Public ceremonies, speeches, and highly visible demonstrations of power were not merely symbolic. They were integral to the exercise of control. The display of force, the orchestration of events, and the projection of decisiveness reinforced perceptions of inevitability and dominance. Citizens, military personnel, and foreign observers were encouraged to interpret these performances as evidence of stability and competence, even as the underlying structures of governance remained fragile. The performative dimension of rule became a mechanism for legitimizing authority, signaling loyalty and deterring dissent, demonstrating that power in Amin's Uganda was as much about perception as it was about administration. The psychological impact of this environment cannot be understated. Individuals at every level of society were required to internalize the logic of fear, loyalty, and compliance. The unpredictability of authority, coupled with the real and perceived threats of reprisal, created a culture in which survival depended on constant vigilance. The socialization of obedience extended beyond the military and civil administration, shaping the behavior of ordinary citizens, families, and communities. Trust became provisional, relationships transactional, and the moral calculus of decision-making increasingly contingent on perceived alignment with the ruler's expectations. This climate of psychological pressure reinforced the centralization of authority while embedding latent social tensions that would later surface in more overt conflict. The consolidation of power during this period also generated profound ethical and moral consequences. Governance by fear and loyalty undermined principles of justice, accountability, and due process. Individuals were evaluated not by competence, fairness, or performance, but by their proximity to perceived threat or their capacity to demonstrate allegiance. This redefinition of political and ethical norms reshaped the moral landscape of governance, creating a system in which authority was absolute, behavior was performative, and survival depended on navigating an environment structured by intimidation and perception. Over time, these dynamics eroded social trust, weakened institutional integrity, and reconfigured the relationship between ruler and citizen. Amin's personal approach to decision-making, rooted in instinct, improvisation, and opportunism, amplified these effects. Policies and directives were implemented rapidly, often without consultation or deliberation, reflecting the priorities of loyalty, control, and immediate expediency. Civil and military officials were compelled to interpret and execute orders in ways that aligned with his perceived intentions, creating a feedback loop in which authority and perception reinforced each other. The combination of personalistic rule, military centrality, and performative projection established a governance model that was both highly efficient in execution and profoundly vulnerable to disruption. The centrality of a single individual made the state responsive in the short term, but fragile in its institutional and social foundations. The interplay of fear, loyalty, and perception also influenced international relations. Foreign governments, observers, and aid agencies were forced to interpret the internal dynamics of Uganda through the lens of unpredictability and personal authority. Decisions that might normally be evaluated through institutional channels were instead assessed according to Amin's perceived priorities, relationships, and temperament. Diplomatic engagement became a negotiation with a singular individual rather than a state apparatus, reflecting the personalization of governance and the centrality of the ruler's will. This dynamic affected economic agreements, foreign aid, and regional politics, reinforcing the perception of Uganda as a nation dominated by a volatile, centralized authority. By the middle of Amin's first year in power, the structural consequences of centralization, militarization, and performative governance were becoming increasingly apparent. Institutions were hollowed out, civil authority subordinated, and social norms reshaped to reflect the imperatives of loyalty and fear. Economic management was distorted, and policy decisions were contingent on proximity to power rather than strategic coherence. Citizens adapted to a climate of surveillance and uncertainty, while the military operated as both instrument and symbol of authority. The consolidation of power, while effective in the short term, had produced a system in which governance was efficient in execution but fragile in foundation, dependent on continuous reinforcement and the alignment of perception with authority. Ultimately, this period illustrates the logic and consequences of personalistic rule in a post-colonial context. Amin's consolidation of authority demonstrates how centralization, militarization, and the manipulation of perception can create immediate dominance, while simultaneously embedding systemic vulnerabilities and social tensions. The interplay of fear, loyalty, and performative governance shaped the daily lives of citizens, the operation of institutions, and the trajectory of the state itself. Amin's Uganda was a nation transformed by the exercise of singular authority, a country in which the structures of governance were inseparable from the imperatives of one man's will, and in which the seeds of both immediate control and future instability were planted with equal force. By the time Amin's regime reached its second year, the consequences of personalistic rule, militarization, and centralized authority were becoming increasingly visible across Uganda. The mechanisms through which he maintained control, fear, loyalty, spectacle, and strategic manipulation, were no longer abstract concepts but daily realities that shaped the lives of ordinary citizens, officials, and soldiers alike. What had begun as a consolidation of power in the wake of the 1971 coup had now matured into a pervasive system, embedding itself into every layer of political, social, and economic life. The nation, once defined by fragile but functioning institutions, was now largely organized around the imperatives of obedience and survival. Authority was absolute, but the structures that supported it were precarious, creating a fragile equilibrium dependent on continuous enforcement and the ruler's personal oversight. One of the most consequential aspects of this period was the intensification of surveillance and internal monitoring. Amin's regime relied not merely on the presence of the military as an enforcement arm, but on a network of intelligence and informants that penetrated both official and civilian spheres. Officers and civil servants were expected to report on one another, and the demonstration of loyalty became performative and public. Ordinary citizens, aware of the consequences of perceived disloyalty, adapted their behaviors accordingly. Rumors, denunciations, and public accusations became common mechanisms of social control, embedding fear into the daily rhythm of life. This network functioned not only as a tool of immediate control, but also as a psychological instrument, reinforcing the perception that authority was omnipresent and inescapable. The surveillance state created a culture in which mistrust was normalized and compliance became a survival strategy. Alongside surveillance, Amin's approach to governance relied heavily on the selective promotion and rewarding of loyalty. Positions of authority, economic opportunities, and political influence were distributed according to perceived fidelity to the regime rather than competence or merit. Officers within the military were elevated based on their alignment with Amin's priorities, while civil administrators were retained or removed according to their demonstrated loyalty. This system entrenched networks of patronage and dependency, ensuring that power flowed through personal connections rather than institutional processes. By tying rewards and survival to allegiance, Amin created a self-reinforcing cycle. Loyalty was continually tested, rewarded, and required, and the mechanisms of governance were increasingly personalized. Institutional efficiency was secondary. What mattered was the consolidation of personal authority.